The moving boxes are still stacked against the wall when my sister calls to say she needs the spare key back. Not hello, not how are you settling in. Just, I need the spare key back, Nora. I'd given it to her 3 weeks earlier when I first moved to Portland, thinking it was the kind of thing sisters do. She'd helped me carry exactly 2 boxes up the stairs, complained about her back, and left before I'd even found where the building manager put my mailbox. I should have noticed the pattern then. I didn't. That was 7 months ago. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Nora, and until 8 months ago, I was 29 years old, working as a junior architect at a mid-size firm in Seattle, earning decent money and sleeping on an air mattress in my older sister's guest bedroom because the Seattle rental market had eaten my savings alive. My sister. I'll call her my sister because that's what she is. Biologically. Her name is Celia. She's 34, married to a man named Forrest, and they own a 4-bedroom Craftsman in Bellevue with heated bathroom floors and a kitchen island the size of a small country. When I lost my apartment lease because my landlord decided to convert the building to condos, Celia had been the one to call first. "You can stay with us," she'd said. "We have so much space." That's what family is for. She'd sounded warm. Genuine. I remember pressing the phone against my ear and feeling for the first time in weeks like something solid was underneath me. I paid them $1,100 a month for the guest room. That was Forrest's idea, he'd said, apologetically. Just to cover utilities and groceries, you understand. I understood, I agreed. I set up a transfer the first of every month and never missed one. What I didn't understand was the conversation I overheard 6 months later, standing in their mudroom with my wet umbrella dripping onto their slate tile. Still in my work coat. Still thinking about the zoning revision I'd been wrestling with all day. "She has to go before the holidays," my sister was saying from around the corner. Her voice was the one she uses when she's decided something and just needs Forrest to confirm it. "I'm not doing Thanksgiving with her here. It changes the whole dynamic. She's paying rent," Forrest said. "Not enough for what it costs me emotionally." A pause. "The room is going to waste on her anyway. I want to turn it into a proper nursery. We've been talking about this. We just started talking about it." Forrest. I stood in the mudroom for a long time after that, long enough that my coat dried and my feet went cold. Then I walked upstairs to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall, which was painted a pale sage green that Celia had picked out when she'd furnished this room for guests she almost never had. I had paid for a room that was never really mine. I didn't say anything that night. I ate dinner, answered questions about my day, helped clear the table. I was raised to be agreeable. Celia was raised the same way, but somewhere along the line she'd figured out how to stop. 2 days later, I came home to a conversation I hadn't been invited to. My mother was sitting at the kitchen island. Celia was across from her with a glass of wine. They stopped talking when I walked in, which told me everything about what the topic had been. My mother smiled in that careful way of hers. "Honey, we were just talking. Celia mentioned you might be thinking of finding your own place soon." I looked at my sister. Celia swirled her wine. "I just said you'd been looking around. That you were excited about having your own space." I had not said that to her. I hadn't said anything remotely like that. "Oh, I'm still figuring things out," I said. Because the alternative was starting a fight in front of my mother, who would find a way to make it my fault by the end of the conversation. That was the night I started quietly saving. Not that I hadn't been saving before. I had, but now I was saving with the specific knowledge that the timeline was not mine to control. What I hadn't counted on was how fast Celia would decide to accelerate it. The first thing she did was tell my mother I'd been making Forrest uncomfortable. I found out from my aunt, who texted me on a Wednesday afternoon. "Is everything okay with you and Forrest? Your mother mentioned something." I stared at the text in the elevator at work and felt the floor drop out from under me. When I called my mother, she was careful with her words the way people are when they've rehearsed a conversation. "Celia said she's noticed some tension," she said. She says you've been a little too familiar with him." Too familiar. Forrest is my brother-in-law. I've known him for 6 years. We talk about basketball and bad movies and which Thai restaurant in the city is actually worth the drive. That is the full extent of our relationship. And I would have sworn on anything that Celia knew that. Apparently, Celia had decided otherwise. When I confronted her, calmly, I thought, considering, she shifted immediately into that particular register she has, the one that sounds reasonable while saying completely unreasonable things. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. "I'm just saying that Forrest has mentioned feeling a little uncomfortable, and I have to take my husband's feelings seriously." She looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "You know how these things can happen without anyone intending them." I asked her to give me one example. One specific thing. She said she didn't want to make it a whole thing. I said it already was a whole thing. Forrest was not in the room. He was never in the room during these conversations. I would come to understand that this was intentional. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote down everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, the $1,100 transfers. I started the folder on my laptop. I didn't know what I was building toward. I just knew that if this was going to become a story, I wanted to be the one with documentation. The formal conversation happened on a Sunday. Celia had made the good coffee, which meant she'd been planning it. She sat across from me with her hands folded and said that she thought it would be best for everyone if I started looking for a place of my own. She said she loved me, but the house needed to return to just being her and Forrest's home. I asked how much time I had. She said 3 weeks would probably be enough. 3 weeks. In the Portland-adjacent rental market in October with first, last, and deposit, which together would run close to $5,000 on top of whatever I could find in that window. I had savings, but not $5,000 of liquid savings, not without draining the emergency fund I'd spent 2 years building. I didn't cry until I was in my car. I let myself have about 4 minutes of it, and then I drove to a coffee shop and opened every rental app I owned. Over the next 18 days, I applied for 14 apartments. I was rejected from 11. 2 never responded. 1 accepted me and then called 2 days later to say the unit had actually already been leased. Sorry for the confusion. I told my coworker about it, a woman named Solange who sits across from me and has the specific gift of listening without offering solutions you didn't ask for. She nodded slowly and then said, "My neighbor is renting out a finished basement unit. It's not on any apps. You interested?" I was interested. In the meantime, I slept in my car twice. Not because I had nowhere else to go, I had a room until the deadline, but because Celia had, in the final week, developed a habit of being loudly upset about something whenever I came home, and some evenings I simply could not make myself walk through that door. The first night was a Tuesday. I parked near my office, reclined the seat, and lay there listening to the rain on the roof. I was 30 years old and I had a master's degree, and I was calculating whether I could run my space heater off the car adapter without killing the battery. The second night was colder. I made it to the basement unit. Solange's neighbor, a retired school teacher named Miss Adeline, rented it to me at below market rate because she said I had an honest face and a firm handshake. And those were her 2 requirements. The space was small, a kitchenette, a bathroom, a room that fit my bed and my drafting table with about 3 feet to spare. But the window space south and the heating worked and it was mine. I did not tell my mother the whole story. I told her I'd found a place near work and that the transition had been a little rocky, but I was settling in. She said she was glad to hear it. She mentioned Celia was doing well. I said that was great. Forrest texted me once about a month after I moved out. It was a short text. It said, "I want you to know I never told Celia I was uncomfortable." I don't know how that started. I sat with that text for a long time. Then I saved it to the folder. 9 months passed. I got promoted, not dramatically, not with a parade, but my name started appearing on the client-facing materials and my opinion started being solicited in meetings I hadn't previously been invited to. I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom across town that had a real kitchen and a bathroom where you didn't have to turn sideways to exist. Miss Adeline cried a little when I moved out and gave me a cutting from her spider plant in a paper cup. Solange and I became real friends. The kind you make dinners for and call on bad days. I adopted a cat named Theodore, who has no interest in me and communicates primarily through mild contempt, and I love him unreasonably. My sister called on a Thursday evening, which I remember specifically because I had just gotten home and was still in my coat when my phone lit up with her name. I stood there and watched it ring. Then I answered. She started with small talk, which she has never been good at, so it lasted approximately 40 seconds before she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. Things have been hard." Another pause. Forrest and I are having some problems. Financial ones. I made a sound that was not quite a response. We had to make some decisions about the business, she said. Forrest had been running a small landscape architecture firm which had, apparently, quietly begun losing clients over the past year. And the house payment it's a lot. It's always been a lot. We've been managing, but this month we didn't. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Stripped of its usual confidence, it sounded smaller. We're behind on the mortgage. I asked how far behind. 3 months, she said. I did the math on what 3 months of a Bellevue mortgage payment meant and said nothing. I know things weren't perfect when you were staying with us, Celia continued. I know the way things ended wasn't. I know it was hard, but we're family and I was wondering if maybe just for a little while we could. I asked her to say it plainly. Could we stay with you? She said. Just until we sort something out. Me and Forrest. Probably a few weeks, maybe 2 months at most. I looked around my 1-bedroom apartment. Theodore looked up from the couch, decided I was uninteresting, and went back to sleep. I need to think about it, I said. I'll call you back tomorrow. I hung up and immediately called Solange. We talked for 2 hours. She asked me the right questions, the ones I needed to actually answer out loud. What did I want to give? What could I afford to lose? What would I regret? She did not tell me what to do. She is good at that. I spent the next day at work in the peculiar state of being functionally present while conducting an entirely separate internal debate. By lunchtime, I had decided 2 things. I was not going to let them stay with me, and I was not going to do nothing. There is a version of this story where I call Celia back and say yes and spend the next 2 months discovering that the pattern doesn't break just because the circumstances have reversed. I have read enough of my own history to know how that version ends. And there is another version, where I simply say no and hang up and feel righteous about it. But neither of those felt like the person I'd been working to become. I called Celia back in the evening. I can't let you stay here, I said. I kept my voice level. My apartment isn't big enough for 2 more people, and honestly, and I need to say this honestly, I don't think it would be good for either of us. She started to respond and I kept going. But I spent yesterday and today putting together a list of resources. Mortgage forbearance programs, emergency housing assistance in Kane County, a nonprofit that specifically works with couples facing foreclosure. I'm going to email it to you tonight. Everything on that list is real. I've checked every link and some of them have fast turnarounds. Silence. Nora, I'm also going to tell you something else, I said. Forrest texted me 9 months ago. He told me he never told you he was uncomfortable with me. I still have the text. I paused. I'm not bringing that up to punish you. I'm bringing it up because I spent 2 nights sleeping in my car at 30 years old, and I would like you to understand that that's what happened. Not a rocky transition. Not me being excited about my own space. Zat. Another silence, longer this time. I didn't know you slept in your car, she said finally. Her voice was different. I know, I said. You didn't ask. I sent the email with the resource list that night. 15 links, organized by category, with notes on eligibility and estimated response times. It took me an hour. I am an architect by training. I organize information the way other people breathe. My mother called 2 days later. I had expected this. She started with the weather and her garden, and then said, Your sister tells me you've had a conversation. We have. She seems to feel that you're Mom, I said, I'm going to stop you there and ask you something directly. When Celia told you I'd been making Forrest uncomfortable, did you ask her for a specific example? A pause. She seemed very sure about it. She seemed sure. But did you ask for an example? The pause was longer this time. I didn't fill it. I have learned this year more than most how to let a silence sit. No, my mother said. I didn't ask. We talked for a long time after that. Not easily, not with everything resolved, but the way you talk when both people in the conversation have decided to stop performing and start being honest. She said she had taken Celia's version of things at face value because Celia had always been the louder one, and that was a habit she hadn't examined until right now. I told her I wasn't asking for an apology. I told her I just needed her to know what had actually happened. She asked if she could come see my apartment sometime. I said yes. 3 weeks after that conversation, Celia and Forrest entered a forbearance agreement with their lender and moved into a short-term rental on the east side while they figured out next steps. I know this because my mother told me, not because Celia called. Celia didn't call. I made peace with that being the shape of things, for now. There is a version of us someday that looks different. I don't know if we'll get there. I think I used to believe that the work of maintaining a relationship was always worth it, that family was something you kept regardless of the cost. I have revised that belief. Not abandoned it. Revised it. The cost is real and it accrues on both sides, and sometimes the most honest thing you can do for a relationship is give it some distance and see what it looks like from there. My apartment gets afternoon light from about 2 until 5. I built a drafting table that fits exactly the space beside the window, and in the early morning when Portland is still gray and quiet, I sit at it with coffee and draw. The projects are getting bigger. A mixed-use development with a public courtyard. A library renovation in a neighborhood that hasn't had a working one in years. Work that feels like it matters. Theodore has recently decided to tolerate my presence when I'm working. He sits at the edge of the table and watches me draw with the air of someone grading papers. I find this comforting in ways I cannot fully explain. Solange and I have standing Tuesday dinners. The person who saves your reputation when HR calls your references is also the person who tells you when you have spinach in your teeth. And I have come to understand that this is what loyalty actually looks like in practice, between real people, not the performance of family. The fact of showing up. Last month, a card arrived in the mail with my mother's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a short note, a few lines, ending with, "I think about what you told me more than you probably realize. I'm glad you told me." She'd tucked in a photo from a hiking trip she and my father had taken, both of them squinting happily into the sun, standing in front of something tall and green. I put it on the fridge. I drive past Celia's old neighborhood sometimes on the way to a client site. The Craftsman is still there, same sage green trim, same river stones lining the front path. There are different cars in the driveway now. Someone has put a basketball hoop near the garage, the small evidence of a different life moving in over the shape of the one that was there before. I don't feel what I expected to feel when I pass it. I expected something, bitterness, or maybe grief, or maybe satisfaction. What I feel is mostly nothing, and then, underneath the nothing, something quieter. The recognition of a thing that ended. The understanding that it was always going to end, that the ending was not a failure, just a conclusion. I keep asking myself, and I think I'll keep asking for a while, what we owe the people who share our blood versus the people who show up, whether repair is always the goal, or whether sometimes the most loving thing is to stop asking a relationship to be something it has never actually been. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure I believe in clean answers anymore. What I have is my drafting table and my south-facing windows and a cat who is slowly, reluctantly learning to tolerate being loved. That feels, most days, like enough. I used to think that the people who hurt you the most were the ones who hated you. I know better now. The people who hurt you the most are usually the ones who love you just enough to feel entitled to you, but not enough to treat you like you matter. Celia didn't hate me. I believe that. She just didn't think about me very much. Not in the way that counts, not in the way that asks, what is this actually costing her? She needed something. I had it. And the story she told herself was that family sharing is natural and uncomplicated. The rent I paid every month, the dinners, the accommodation of her moods, none of that registered as a cost on her ledger. It registered as the baseline, the thing I owed her for the privilege of existing in her space. That's not cruelty exactly. It's something quieter and more common. It's what happens when someone has never been asked to account for what they take. What I've come to understand is that actions have weight, and weight accumulates. Every month I paid rent that went unacknowledged. Every accusation that was made without evidence. Every night I spent in a cold car while she slept in a house with heated floors. Those things didn't disappear because no one was keeping score. They stacked up, quietly, and eventually the stack became the foundation of everything that came after. Her call, my answer, the list of resources I sent instead of a spare key. I used to feel guilty about that list. Like I was hiding behind practicality to avoid generosity. I don't feel that way anymore. What I gave Celia was something I genuinely wish someone had given me when I was parking my car near my office at midnight trying to calculate heating costs. Real information. Actual options. The dignity of being treated like someone capable of solving her own problem. That's not the same as doing nothing. And it's not the same as doing everything. The hardest thing I've learned this past year isn't how to set a boundary. It's how to trust my own memory. When Celia told my mother I'd been making Forrest uncomfortable, I started questioning what I actually knew. My own behavior, my own intentions, my own read on the situation. That second guessing is what happens when someone you're supposed to trust tells a story about you that doesn't match the one you lived. It takes a long time to trust your own version again. What helped was the folder. The dates, the transfers, the texts. Not because I needed proof for anyone else, I needed it for myself. A record that said, this is what happened, this is real, you're not misremembering. Solange showing up the way she did, the couch, the landlord introduction, the Tuesday dinners, taught me something I hadn't been looking for. That the people who show up for you are rarely the ones you expected, and that showing up, consistently, without drama, without keeping score, is its own kind of wisdom. It's the thing I try to practice now, imperfectly, with the people who've earned it. I'm still figuring out what I owe Celia, not in a transactional sense, I've settled that account, but in a human sense. Whether the relationship has a future, whether repair is worth building toward, or whether the most honest thing I can do is let it remain what it is right now, quiet, distant, not entirely closed. I think the answer changes depending on the day. I've made peace with that.